So I'd really like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Mark Flaherty. I hope I've got the pronunciation about right there, Mark. Mark is a computer programmer and was formerly a complete skeptic about astrology until it found him. This was around 2010 when Mark was living at a retreat centre in the Peruvian Amazon, and a colleague there who happened to be an astrologer from London gave a 1-hour overview of the subject, and it completely blew Mark's mind. And from that moment on, he was hooked. So for a long time after that, he spent every spare moment he had studying astrology. And this colleague introduced Mark to his teachers, Geoffrey Cornelius and Maggie Hyde, who, along with Derek Appleby and Gordon Watson, founded the Company of Astrologers in the 1980s. Mark's been studying periodically with Geoffrey and Maggie for the last 10 years, completing their foundation course in Horary Astrology, amongst other things. And Geoffrey and Maggie teach from the perspective that all astrology is a practice of divination, and that's a perspective that Mark aligns with. So his ongoing study of astrology continues to be an important part of his personal spiritual practice and an ever-deepening exploration of the nature of human existence. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you, Mark, to talk about horary, astrology as divination. So thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Julianne. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I just want to point out, I was a computer programmer. That was many years ago, not anymore. my Vagoan side's like, let's get that quite precise.
Of course, sorry for that. Thanks.
Fine. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. I have no idea how much you all know about horary, and so my aim is to provide an overview. You know, it's such a big topic that it's not going to be teaching horary, but I'm going to introduce kind of the philosophical aspects of it, a brief look at some of the main technical points of it, how it differs from natal astrology, and then have a look at either one or, hopefully if there's time, two example charts from my own practice to see how it works in the real world. So what is horary? Well, it is a method of interpreting a horoscope for the moment a question is posed, with the aim being to determine the answer to the question or the outcome of the issue. And so it addresses very specifically and directly a particular question. And in that way, it's very different from natal astrology. And you don't need a person's natal chart when you're doing horary. Sometimes there can be a resonance there. Sometimes in a horary chart, it will reflect something in the natal chart, and it can add extra information, but really it stands alone, and you use this chart regardless of a person's time of birth. So it has a very unique and precise technical aspect, which as an Uber Virgo, I quite like, that isn't used in natal. So I'm going to talk a bit about the specifics there of how it differs. So, I mean, a couple of example questions you might ask. Should I take this job offer? Should I move to Hawaii? These kinds of very specific questions. And the horary chart is for the moment and the place that the astrologer hears the question. The reason for that being the astrology exists, or the chart exists, as soon as there's an astrologer. And so rather than when a person asks the question, it's when it comes to an astrologer, which may or may not be the same moment. And as with a lot of things in astrology, different practitioners do things differently. So this is how I do it. This is how I learned. It's what makes sense for me. And other horary astrologers, they may use, for example, the location of the person asking the question. And it will still work because, as I understand astrology as this mystical art rather than a science, it is astrology is conscious and alive, and it will, you could say, mold to the astrologer's practice. And so, well, another example is, say, how all of the different house systems, and there can be endless debates about which is the right house system. And Jeffrey Cornelius one time said to me, which was such a relief, he was like, it doesn't matter. It's like, pick one, stick with it, and it will work for you, because it's the kind of the melding of your consciousness, the astrologer's practice. It's not like this objective, this is the right chart system, house system. So I'm not saying you should use the location and time that the astrologer hears the question, but that's what makes sense to me philosophically. That's what I use, and it works for me. And in terms of house systems, I use Placidus because that's what I was taught. And I know a lot of people, a lot of horary astrologers will use Regiomontanus, I imagine because that's what William Lilly used. And again, no right or wrong answer in that. So for me, all astrology actually, and I think it's particularly true with, or particularly obvious with horary, is that it is it's an act of divination. It's an act of communing with spirit, and I treat it very much as a ritual. And so it's not this, divination. So the etymology of the word divination is either to be inspired by a god or to reveal that which is hidden. And so for me, astrology generally, as you know, I learned from Jeffrey, which, by the way, if anyone hasn't read his book Moment of Astrology, it's some of it's quite hard going. It's some incredible astrology, and takes a few reads often to really get it, but it's a seminal work on his hypothesis of astrology as divination. And astrology is also a craft with a very technical side, and particularly with horary, very specific rules and techniques that need to be followed. And so it's this both and, it's this mystical art with the craft and the technical side of it. And so it's this mixture of the technique with an sort of a more poetic, imaginative interpretation of symbol. And my take on it, my take on life, is that spirit exists. We are communing with spirits in different ways in our lives. And so for me, a horary practice, creating a chart for myself or interpreting one for somebody, is an act of communing with spirits. And I don't think it's necessary to believe in spirits to practice horary, but that's very much how I approach it. And I have the sense that the kind of the presence and the reverence and what one brings to it directly impacts and affects its efficacy. Okay. And I should also say, horary doesn't always give you an answer to the question. I'll say more about this in a little while, but an essential, crucial part of judging a horary chart is knowing when to put it down and not give an answer. And I'm just going to screen a little slideshow. All right. So, what kind of questions can be asked with horary? This is a really important place to start with it. And the first fundamental thing is it should be an important question in your life. It's not something to be used for trifling matters. You know, it's not, I don't know, what would be a trifling matter? Should I go to the cinema this evening? You know, there's something of the, in my experience, for the charts I've cast for myself and for my clients, the more important the question, the more significant in a person's life tends to be the clearer the guidance, the clearer the answer that's given. And so the energy and the intent that is brought to the question really matters in terms of the answer that you get. Excuse me. When to ask the question, really, I think the moment to ask a question is when you have the thought, maybe I should ask a horary about this. So there's no set time frame. It could be, you know, almost immediately on contemplating a question. It could be months after sitting with it and figuring out what's the right thing to do in a situation. But there has to be this sense of, yeah, kind of wanting to take the question deeper. It's like wanting confirmation or guidance from the spirits. And ideally, I don't think this is a law set in stone, but ideally a question that you can do something about. Because if you can't do something about it, there's often not that much point in even asking a question. You know, I think the best kind of horary is really a tool for helping you take the right action in a situation. And I really like what Jeffrey said about this, about horary astrology being a test of one's true desire. And he explained how the word desire comes from the Latin desideri, meaning of or from the stars. And so, you know, how I take that is the stars also being a metaphor for higher intelligence or divine will, perhaps. And so when we're asking a horary, we are saying, is this my true desire? Which I think is one and the same as, is this divine will in this situation? Is this the highest action that could be taken? And in my experience, I've got answers I didn't want and followed them, and things turned out for the best, even when I was really not convinced it was the right thing to do. But that's kind of like a test for me in a way, because as a practitioner of this, you know, I feel like I have to be willing to act on questions if I ask them and there's a clear answer. Yeah. Oh yeah, and I love etymology. So there's desire, desideri. I don't know if you're aware, but there's two other really common words that have their roots in astrology. One is consider. So con and sider is to be with the stars. When you consider something, it's like, is this with the stars? And the other one's disaster, disastro. So disaster is going against the stars, going against divine will. Okay. Other important considerations in asking questions. You must have a mandate to ask a question. So it's, well, two parts to this. One, not something to try and gain information that you're not supposed to have. So as an example, it's like if you're just being nosy, is my friend's wife cheating on him, for example? If your friend comes to you and asks you, then you have a mandate, you can ask that question. But if not, then you have to be really careful in kind of meddling in something that isn't your business. If I remember rightly, Jeffrey, when I was learning with Jeffrey, he put it as mind your own business. And the other one's those questions on a world stage, which I see quite a lot of in the public arena, of people asking these big worldly questions. It could be, will Joe Biden win the next election? I personally don't think that's the kind of appropriate question for asking. If Joe Biden came to me and said, will I win the next election? Maybe it would be valid to ask it. And so, when I first discovered Horary, I was like, wow, it's like this, I have access to this cosmic supercomputer, all-knowing. I can put any question in and get any answer. And yeah, it was very naive, but I was like, wow, now I have access to all the information in the universe. And it just doesn't work like that. It's a tool for helping you with what you need or what your client needs to know about, and really should be kept within those parameters, I think. Some other considerations. So the precise wording is really important. And this can be a process in itself of, you have an idea of what the issue is, but you don't always know what am I really asking here? And so just the process, going through the process of getting clear on what I want to ask can be really helpful just in clarifying the whole situation for the person. So really taking the time to formulate the truest question is part of the process with Horary. And it should also be one that it's possible to answer with astrology. And a good example of this is either or questions are not very easy to answer with Horary. Should I do this or should I do this? Really it's there's a consideration here around taking ownership. It's not farming out responsibility of your life to astrology and saying, tell me what to do, but rather it is, as I said before, it's like we have a sense, we have an idea, and then it's like trying to find confirmation or clarity. Is this right? And so if there is an either or, then it's really helpful to pick a side. And it's like, I might only be like 51% thinking this is the right thing to do. But then you ask, should I move to Hawaii rather than New York? And so then you're honing in on one of the options, and then you're much more likely to get a readable chart and a useful answer. And that's also about taking this active role in the situation. rather than passively, tell me what to do. And this is also really important, is don't ask the question unless you're actually willing to act on it. Often people want to use it as like, oh, I'll just see what it says, and then I'll decide whether or not to follow that. And, this comes back to me to this idea of it being participatory, and it requires our own willingness. It requires our consciousness, our presence, our investment in the question, that what we bring to it, the energy we bring to it, influences in ways that I'll never understand, but it influences the chart and the guidance that's given. And last consideration or thing to mention is that the chart tells a story. So there are specific rules to be followed, but it's also really essential to develop this symbolic perspective and understanding to be able to interpret the story, to interpret the chart, to tell a story. Sometimes it's as simple as, yes, do this, but usually there's a whole wealth of information in a chart, background, specific details. And the art is really, step one, and it can be good enough, is giving an answer to a person. But often the unfolding of the story that the chart shows can also be something really important that somebody needs to hear. Okay, so check on the time, 20 minutes. Okay. I want to make sure I have time for going through some examples. But I'm going to go through now, possibly quite quickly, but the very basic technique of horary and how greatly it differs from natal astrology. And to do that, there's a few, there's certain knowledge that I need to assume that you may or may not have. Firstly, that's the concept of planetary rulerships. So, Mars being the ruler of Aries, Venus of Taurus, etc. The concept of house rulerships. Houses so important in horary. So, for example, in this chart with Aries on the cusp of the third house, Mars is the ruler of the third house. So that's what I mean by house rulerships. And, the moon would rule the sixth house with Cancer on the cusp. Also really important in horary is the difference between applying and separating aspects. And so very briefly, this is, it's whether at the moment of the chart, whether the planets are moving into an exact aspect or moving away from the exact aspect, right? So in this chart, you've got Mercury at 10 Virgo, you've got Venus at 7 Cancer. Because Mercury is the faster moving planet, and that's also something you need to know with horary, the relative speeds of motions of the different planets. Because Mercury usually is moving faster than Venus, that's separating because it's 10 degrees and 7 degrees. So a few days prior, they would have been together maybe at about 4 or 5 degrees of their signs is when the aspect would have been exact. Mercury moving faster is moving away. And Mercury is applying to Neptune because Mercury is 10, Neptune is 13 Pisces, Mercury moves faster than Neptune. So with horary, this is really important because applying aspects, one of the fundamental differences with horary is it's dynamic, it's in movement, it's rather than a static chart. And so you need to know where the planets have come from and where they're going to. That's how the story unfolds. So applying aspects are what is coming in the future in regard to the question that's been asked, whereas separating aspects are something about the background, what has led up to the question being asked. Okay, so some key concepts, terms in horary that you probably don't hear elsewhere. The querent and the quesited. I love the old language that often comes with horary. So when you're asking a question, it's really, you're not using all the planets in the chart. You're looking for which are the key planets, which are the significators. And the two main significators are always the querent and the quesited, which means the person asking the question, the querent, which is always the ruler of the ascendant, and the quesited is what is being asked about. And so the significator for the quesited is the ruler of the house in question. So if you're asking about, should I buy a dog? A pet would be sixth house. So the ruler of the sixth house is the significator for the dog. And so in horary, the significators, the planets are very real people, places, things in the world in relation to the question. Sometimes it can also be, more psychological, and it can say things on the inner level about the person asking the question, but it's very earthy, concrete, real world. The symbols are specific things in the question. And the moon carries great importance in all horaries. It's seen as the co-significator. And so the moon, because it's the fastest moving body, it has this sense of like the flow, the movement of the energy, the progression of the situation in it. And the moon can either signify the querent or the quesited. And also it often, the placement of the moon by sign, by house, can often encapsulate the whole question. So it can really describe the core of the matter. And it's always really good when looking at a horary to ask, why is the moon where it is? And if you can't answer that, if it doesn't seem to make any sense, then it might be difficult to actually interpret the chart. And fundamental to horary is the concept of perfection, which means that the significators must come together by major applying aspect. Okay, so for example, the querent is 10 degrees of Cancer, the quesited is at 12 degrees of Cancer, and the querent is the faster moving body, so say Mercury and Jupiter. As you go forwards in time, Mercury will catch up to and perfect, in other words, make exact the aspect of the quesited, of the significator of the question. So there's this dynamism in the chart. You're never looking at a static chart with horary. You often have to either use an ephemeris, or if you have the software, move the chart forwards in time to see, well, where are the planets going? What aspects are they going to make next? Because that's everything in terms of where the matter is leading in the question. And as you might imagine, there's a lot of gradations of complexity with horary. But the simplest, neatest answer to a horary is when the significators come together and it's the next aspect they make. If they come together, but they're making other aspects before, then that's other things or people, situations in the way, which, depending on the nature of the symbols and the situation, may or may not lead to the matter being resolved in a good way ultimately. And the other key point about this is that the perfection should take place before either planet changes sign. So that's also really important, because it's seen as the signs that the planets are in at the moment of the question. It's like the field of play of the question. And so there can be something significant in, for example, two planets are coming together, but one of them changes sign first. That may actually describe something that's happening in the world. So, maybe it's a love question, and Venus is coming to a sextile with Mars, but Mars is right at the end of the sign, and it actually moves into the next sign before the perfection takes place. Then the man's probably going to run away. He's changed his mind. He's going somewhere else. And the other thing about horary that's different from natal is orbs aren't really applicable. Meaning, what most matters is the next aspect rather than how close it is. So, for example, it's unlikely, but let's say the moon might move 15 degrees in a sign or 20 degrees before it makes another major aspect. That would still be considered perfection if it's then applying to the quasitive. It will probably indicate that it's going to take a long time for the matter to come to pass, but there's nothing standing in the way of it. So you've not got the traditional, degrees of orbs that you would have that you'd use in natal. And then the kind of aspect that the planets come together by is also crucial. And so we're only looking at the major aspects here. Minor aspects are not counted in horary. Oh, is the chart radical? In other words, does the symbolism match the question? So again, it's not just, do the planets come together, then it's a yes. You need to be able to interpret the symbols and say, this fits the situation. And that's, a key part of this sort of poetic, imaginative approach to telling the story of the chart, and that you need to see. So, a radical chart, for example, might be you're asking, should I buy a dog? And the moon is in the 6th house. The moon is in the house being asked about. That's a good indication that the chart's fitting, assuming other things also line up. What else about that? Oh, I think I missed out here. I don't think I put this in my handouts, but just to go back to the types of perfection, just very briefly, really, ideally, you want either a conjunction, a sextile, or a trine, the good aspects. That generally indicates no hindrance to the matter, things going well. If you've got a square, it tends to indicate incomplete success. So you might ask, for example, you're asking about a court case and will I get this compensation? Will I get the money? And the significators come together, but it's by a square, then, it's probably saying you'll get something, but you won't be very happy with what you get. So it's a partial success. And when you get an opposition, then that's often said to be, you can have it if you want it, but you'll probably regret it. And I actually had this, a friend's wife came to me and asked about leaving her husband for another man. And I mean, I was in a bit of an ethical dilemma, even whether to take that on. But I was like, well, I have a look at the chart, and I mean, put simply, the significators came together by opposition, and there was a lot of Scorpio involved, and it was basically saying this is just lust, and you can have it, and you'll come to regret it if you do. And so I actually felt comfortable giving that judgment to her, and she did heed it. Okay, I don't know what else is on here. Strictures. How much do I want to go into this? Strictures are, well, I'll say something about it. Strictures against judgment are certain things that show up in a chart that are a warning to the astrologer not to give an answer and not to judge the chart. And there may be a perfection in it. The chart may be radical. It may be seeming to give a clear answer. But, and this is how I was taught and how I work with strictures, is it's heeding a warning from the spirits to say, you know, no good can come from you giving a judgment in this. And there can be various reasons for that. One of the classic ones, if Saturn is in the 7th house, the 7th house is the astrologer in a horary chart. So you're not objectively standing apart from the horary as an astrologer, right? You're in it, you're immersed in the configuration. And so when you have Saturn in the 7th, if somebody else has asked you the question, if it's your own question, somebody else has asked you the question, and Saturn's in the 7th, that is an indication that your judgment is off. You're gonna say something either wrong or like unhelpful or potentially damaging to the client, and so it's a warning not to say anything. And you don't have to tell the client that, you know, different strictures can mean different things, but, you know, it's often as simple as just saying, sorry, you know, I can't give an answer now, and that's good enough. And for me, this is important as I work with it as this kind of ritual practice, that that I'm going to heed the warning. I'm not going to take the risk. And, you know, people judge charts with strictures in, and I think in the right situation, if you're a really, really good astrologer, there are times when it's acceptable. I know William Lilly did it. I've seen Jeffrey do it. I am not William Lilly and I am not Jeffrey, and I don't do it because, yeah, I like to keep it simple. And yeah, I mean, you can read there the other strictures. I think I'd rather spend more time on looking at charts than going through them anymore, and specifically what they're about. So what have we got? 23 minutes left. So I've got a couple of charts. So this was my own question. And it's important in horary to judge a chart to get as much background information as possible from if somebody's asking you a question. It's not just, you know, here's the question, because the more information you have, the more you have to go on in terms of is the symbolism fitting. And so this was a really important question to me. So this was during lockdown. At the time I was living in the mountains in Peru, just outside of Cuzco. And when lockdown happened, I was actually visiting a friend in the jungle, and I got stuck there for about a month. And then after a month, I got to Lima, the capital, and then I was stuck there. And I mean, it was, the lockdown was serious in Peru. It was like police and army on the streets, roadblocks everywhere, huge guns everywhere, tanks on the streets. It was like, you don't go anywhere. But I really wanted to get home, and I didn't know how long this was going to go on for. And so me and there happened to be another friend who lived in the same village as me, who'd just flown back into Peru, also stuck in Lima. And so we had decided to get a taxi from Lima to Cuzco, which is about a 24-hour drive without any stops. It's a long way. And we found this taxi driver who was willing to take us. And so what else is important about this? Okay, so yeah, no travel was allowed at all. But I got in touch with the British Embassy, and I'd managed to get this document called a salvo conducto, like a safe passage document, that in theory entitled me to pass through all the checkpoints and get home. But then, just before we were due to travel, the embassy contacted me and said, the situation's changed, the document's no longer valid, but I still have the document. And then I'd been in touch with another friend who'd just come the other way, and he'd basically given us the lay of the land. And it was like, he said, there's about 25 roadblocks, and at various places along the way, they're checking people's temperature to see if they have COVID. And my friend who was also in Lima with me, he'd actually just come back from Africa, and he had malaria. And so he had fevers. So it was a pretty risky thing to take on this journey, but it was also, the alternative wasn't very good either. You know, we could have been stuck in Lima for months. And yeah, and as it turned out, you know, it was, I don't even know how long. The serious lockdown went on for close to a year in Peru. It was crazy. Anyway, so I think that's all the background. So there's a pretty good chance that we weren't going to get through. We'd either get turned back, or even worse, they would just stop us in the middle of nowhere and make us do 2 weeks quarantine in a hut in rural Peru. So I asked this Horary because I was like, I didn't know what to do. And so let's start with the basics. So first, where's the querent? Well, we've got Sag rising. So the querent is Jupiter, ruler of Sag. Jupiter's here, stuck between Pluto and Saturn. So it's not technically besiegement because Saturn's actually in a different sign, but it's a pretty good symbolism for being locked down, like stuck between two pretty heavy, unpleasant planets, and Jupiter being in, is it fall or detriment? I think Jupiter's in fall in Capricorn, right? So it's also a weak Jupiter. And that, I should say, is also one of the key things. There's so much to Horary, but dignities of planets, dignities of significators, really important. Planet in rulership is really strong in the situation. You know, a planet in detriment, in fall, is weakened. So there's Jupiter. Now, it's a third house question because it's a car journey, and it's quite a long distance journey, but car's a third house, and the moon is in the third house. So if there was any doubt, is it a third or ninth house question? Well, the chart is guiding here. The moon's in the third house. And so the quesited, the car journey, what's being asked about is, it's a third house question. So we got Aquarius on the cusp. Now, first go-to in Horary is always traditional ruler as the quesited. But that's not a hard and fast rule. Again, it's being guided by the chart. So if the modern ruler is more symbolically fitting in the matter, then you would choose that instead. And in this case, so we go to Saturn first and look at Saturn in Aquarius in the second, and then Uranus is more fitting in this case for two reasons. One is that it's a Uranian type journey, right? It's risky, it's unpredictable. It's like, we don't know what's going to happen. Expect the unexpected, Uranus. And the moon's next aspect is actually going to a sextile with Uranus. So it's really highlighting in this chart Uranus as being the quesited. So we'll look at the basic movements of the planet's perfections, and then I'll describe also a lot of the other detail that's in the chart. So, and I should say also, previous aspects can say something about like what's led up to this situation. And so the moon's previous aspect was actually a sextile to the sun, just when the moon was in late Aquarius. And the sun ruling the ninth house of foreign countries, in this case, I took this as being the contact with the British embassy, because being in Peru, Britain and the British embassy is actually relative to there, it's a foreign country. And the sun is exalted in Aries there, so there's something good about the connection with the embassy. And the part of fortune also right on the cusp of the third, the house of documents, this could be seen to be the salvo conducto, the safe passage document. So there's things that are symbolically fitting here. Now the perfection, or the next aspect, so Jupiter, the querent, where's that going? Its next aspect, it's not doing anything until it changes sign and hits Saturn. Is that right? That's right. Yeah, I mean, the moon will get to it. The moon will sextile it, but the moon's got to do a lot of other things first. The moon's next aspect is a sextile to the quesited. So this looks like a perfection. We've got a good aspect, the moon going to the ruler of the third, the car journey. But it's Uranus, right? So even though it's a sextile, it's not necessarily, it's not going to a sextile of Jupiter in Cancer. It's like, oh, that'll be a lovely, pleasant journey home. If the journey is undertaken, it's going to be Uranian type journey. And, I also took the moon in Pisces as being like a journey of faith, because I was praying and talking to spirits like crazy for this journey. And even with this chart, I spoke to one of my teachers about it. I changed my mind like 4 times on the day before. I was like, this is ridiculous, I'm not going. And my friend actually convinced me. He was, I don't know why, but he was just like, I think it's going to be fine. I think we should go. And because the alternative was so terrible, I was like, okay, let's go. And for me, I based the decision on this sextile. I was like, it looks risky, but it's not a square to Uranus. It's not an opposition to Uranus. It's good enough, given the situation. And, I have to say, I've done a lot of quite crazy things in my life, but this felt like the riskiest thing I'd ever done. It was so unpredictable. And, the police and the army in Peru, they don't mess around if they take a disliking to you. So yeah, it was all on the faith of the moon in Pisces and the sextile to Uranus. And Well, we went, and it was a Uranus type journey. It was, first of all, it went really smoothly. It was the we had this amazing driver. He was really young, but he just had such a sense of authority. And as we were getting out of Lima, he'd pull up at all these roadblocks, and it'd be like, "We're with the British Embassy, let us through." And they're like, "Oh, okay." And like he had this really nice car with blacked out windows, and he kind of waved. Which, by the way, the letter that the British Embassy sent, it was just like a PDF, and there was no official stamp on it or anything. And it was actually my friend's friend forged a British Embassy stamp that was on the document. So it wasn't even really a proper document. But anyway, so we went through many roadblocks, and every one it got harder and harder to get through. And every one he talked his way through. And it was amazing. It was just like, "No, you can't come through. There'll be loads of other people stuck at these roadblocks." And he's like, "No, we're fine. We're good. Just let us go. We'll just go. We'll be fine." And yeah, for a day, he got us through roadblock after roadblock. Um, and by the way, and we wouldn't have done it without him. Like he was so incredible. And you could also see the taxi driver as being the Saturn, the ruler of the third, another take on Saturn. In its rulership, Saturn in Aquarius, he had this Saturnian authority and final dispositor of the chart, disposing of Mars, like the natural ruler of the police and army. Like he had this sense of authority over them. And then we got to the final roadblock and entering the Cuzco region, and which was quite a big one because all the others were like, "Oh, we're just passing through your region. We're not going to stop here." And so at this one, the guy said, "Okay, I'm going to call the British Embassy and check that it's okay with them." And so we're like, "Okay." And fortunately, it was about 7 o'clock in the morning at this point. We'd kind of spent the night somewhere. This was day 2. And there was no one in the British Embassy. And so for some reason, the guy at the policeman said, "You carry on and I'll keep calling the embassy. And if I get through to them, if there's any problems, I'll radio ahead and we'll stop you further ahead." So then the taxi driver's just driving like a lunatic. Anyway, there's a bunch more crazy stuff to the story, but at the end of it, so we had to switch cars to a local taxi driver friend for the last bit to get through the very local area. And his brother took our suitcases in one car. This taxi driver took us in the other. And the brother got caught by the police with these suitcases, one of which had like a label showing like my friend had just flown into the country. And so they wanted to fine him thousands of dollars for bringing gringos into infected people basically into this region. And he managed to bribe them with soft drinks, basically. Inca Cola's like the big drink there. It's like their Coca-Cola. And he bought all the policemen a bottle of Inca Cola, and they let him through. They let him off. And afterwards, when I was talking to my teacher about this, he was like, "Oh, that's like Neptune on the IC." Neptune being like fizzy drinks. It's like to get home, there's the like Neptunian shenanigans. And so the final, because if that wasn't Uranian enough, the final twist in the Uranian tale, we got home, and then the next day, the taxi driver called me and said, "I've just been stopped trying to get back to Lima. The police are really mad that you got through, and they're coming looking for you." And they had our address. They had took photos of our documents. So I basically spent 3 days hiding in my house with the curtains shut, panicking every time a car came up the road. But they never came. And so, yeah, that was the Uranian car journey. Time for one more. How long have we got?
Good to see another one, actually, Mark, if that's possible.
Yeah, I won't. There's not so much. I can do a less information, less story. This is a chart. Check I've got the right one. Yeah. So this is a chart a friend asked me, who he just spent about 6 months at this ashram in India, was totally like besotted by this place and the guru, and was basically, he said to me, you know, this feels like my calling, my place. I want to devote my life to this, basically become a monk in this ashram, and you know, devote his life to his spiritual journey there. And he asked me, you know, should I go? Is this right for me? And so we've got what have we got? We got Aquarius rising, so he's like looking for freedom, and he's Saturn in Sag, you know, the sign of higher knowledge, higher wisdom, and it's Saturn. He's committed, right? He's in it for the long haul, and looking for liberation through this spiritual search. And then the Quasited, this is an interesting example, because my go-to would have been an ashram being the 9th house. But when I looked at the symbolism, the ruler of the 9th being Venus in Cancer, not related, not interacting really with the chart, with anything else, the other significators, it didn't seem to fit. But what did fit was the 11th house, and the 11th also having this sense of kind of the community, the collective, and because the ruler of the 11th is Jupiter, and it's on the cusp of the 9th, you know, that seemed to fit to me as being, I took it as Jupiter being the Quasited. You could probably make a case for either way, and actually, I don't think it matters, but I preferred Jupiter here. Now, what is interesting, I cut to the chase. So, well, where's Saturn going? So Saturn's retrograde, first of all. So a retrograde querent doesn't paint him in a good light. Like, there's something about he's going against his better nature or his own nature in this maneuver. You know, he's weakened, shown by the fact that he's retrograde. And it looks like he's going to Jupiter. It looks like the next aspect, because it's retrograde and Jupiter's moving forwards, it looks like there's going to be a sextile to Jupiter, which, you know, could be taken to be the ashram and the community there. But actually what you've got, and this is where it's really important to move the chart forward to see what is actually, to know the relative speeds of motion, because what you might notice is here's the sun really prominent on an angle. Planets on angles often have something important to say. The sun in Leo right on the descendant is really prominent, and actually, because it moves a lot quicker than Jupiter, Saturn's next aspect is actually going to be to the sun rather than to be to Jupiter. So if you think, you know, the day after this, the sun will be at 15 Leo, 16, 17, 18, 19. So in 5 or 6 days, it's going to hit Saturn well before Saturn and Jupiter come together. And well, I didn't actually give this in the background, but he was really besotted with this guru. It was like all he could say was, so and so says this, so and so says this. And I'm like, well, what do you think? What do you say? And he's like, well, I don't know, but so and so says this. And it really, for me, and you know, I felt like the chart bore this out, but it was like this wasn't good for his spiritual search. This was like the sun in Leo. He's like starstruck with the guru, and he just wants to be around the guru. And you know, the sign of Leo, it's his heart. You could say he's given his heart away to the guru rather than, and he's going against his own spiritual wisdom. Saturn retrograde in Sag. And then to back it all up, and is often the case in a good horary, the same thing will show in more than one way. The moon's next aspect. So the moon's in the 12th, which, as you know, you may know, traditionally the 12th house could be seen as the house of self-undoing, right? It's kind of like a blind spot. It's not the best place for a planet. And so something he's not seeing, and the moon is moving to oppose Mars. And, you know, an opposition to a malefic, and, you know, Mars like cuts. So again, it's like cutting him off from Leo, cutting himself off from his own heart. There's no good fortune in this chart. There's nothing that's saying that's a good idea. You should do that. Yeah. And something about needing to find his own spiritual truth, like he needs to change direction. You know, he needs to not be retrograde. He needs to go direct, find his own direction. And, you know, it's totally his free will what he chooses to do. You know, this isn't like, well, yeah. I told him, and he was devastated. He was really devastated, and he decided not to go. And personally, I was happy with that, but you know, I also feel like it wasn't just what I wanted. You know, I really felt it was borne out by the chart, and yeah. So, to my knowledge, he never went back there, and my Virgo self is smiling because it's exactly 2030. So I'll leave that there, exactly on the hour.